Welcome to the NICU Today podcast, a podcast to give families a new point of support as they navigate the NICU journey. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcast and share this episode with anyone who might find it helpful. Welcome back to the NICU Today podcast. Through this podcast, we love to share extraordinary stories of resilience and triumph. In today's episode, we delve into the incredible journey of a baby born at 30 weeks, weighing just 2 pounds, 3 ounces. This little warrior faced not only the challenges of prematurity, but also confronted a rare heart condition known as transposition of the great arteries. At just 5 weeks old, this tiny hero underwent open heart surgery, paving the way for a remarkable tale of strength and perseverance. Thank you for listening as we navigate through 158 days spent in the hospital, uncovering a story of unwavering courage and the power of hope. Here to share more is Colleen Weimer, sweet Sully's strong mother. So happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us today.
Anytime.
Well, now in the introduction, we shared a little bit about your family story, but you got to tell us more, Colleen. Where did this all begin?
So it was actually kind of interesting because Sully was not our first preemie. We've talked about this a little bit before. Prior to Sully, we had a 28-weeker, and that was an experience. And I remember it was just so hard to go through that. So we had Quinn, she's 7 now, and we waited a very long time because the experience, obviously, when you have a very tiny baby is traumatic, and that was traumatic for me. But we knew we wanted to grow our family. So Sully was, my other kids are 9 and 7, so there's quite an age gap. So when we found out, we were obviously very excited, but, a little scared because I had preeclampsia in a previous pregnancy. And unfortunately, that's one of those things that tends to sometimes follow you from one pregnancy to another. So I kind of had that looming over my head when I got pregnant, that there was a possibility that I could have another preemie baby. And everything seemed to be going okay until our 20-week scan. We had gone to the high-risk doctor, and they saw something strange with Sully's heart, and they referred us to a fetal echo for a fetal echo. And when we went there, they also thought something looked a little bit off. And at that point, they referred us to CHOP to get a better look. And that's where around 22 weeks, they diagnosed her with something called transposition, or it's called dextro transposition of the great arteries. So that's kind of when we knew, okay, this is going to be a little bit different. Now we have to give birth to our baby 2 hours away from where we live. We obviously had the added risk of having a preemie baby, and now she had this really serious heart condition that requires an open heart surgery pretty soon after birth. So that's what brought us down to CHOP in the first place, and we're definitely so thankful that's where we wound up. But scary nonetheless when you get that kind of news.
Well, and when you talk about having to deliver 2 hours from where you live, I mean, that in and of itself, you're going away from the doctors that the environment that your hometown, your home where your
Yeah.
older children are, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you found out that you needed to go to CHOP, when did you go to Philadelphia and to CHOP? And I know we met through the Ronald McDonald House,
Yeah.
but would love for you to share with the listeners as well how you got connected with Ronald McDonald House.
So it was kind of interesting. The Ronald McDonald House, I have a cousin who, I can't remember exactly what his diagnosis is, but he has a microdeletion or a duplication. He has a shunt on his brain, and he's been going down to Ronald McDonald House his whole life. So I knew, obviously, of its existence before that. So I kind of knew at that point that that was a good resource to use, as well as a CHOP. They go through all the resources with you that they have. Ronald McDonald was obviously one of them. And that's kind of how we wound up there.
Were you at Ronald McDonald House before you delivered? Or after you delivered, Sully?
So it was actually a little bit complicated, that part in itself, because we had gone down to CHOP for our appointments, but we had really only gone down to CHOP for about 2 appointments, and they hadn't even transferred our care yet to CHOP. So when I started to have symptoms of preeclampsia, they told me to go to the local hospital and that they would send me down there. But unfortunately, it didn't go that smoothly. And after a little bit of kind of fighting with them and getting permission and getting medical transport and a little bit of time kind of saying, like, if my baby's born, they can't help her here. So it took a little persuading, but they did transport me down to Philadelphia from Monmouth Medical at that point. And it was about 10 days, I think, before she was born.
Okay. Now you get this difficult diagnosis for Sully. Not sure what your future looks like, right? With her, we've talked about this. When other families are facing this type of difficult diagnosis, and for you looking back on your experience,
Yeah.
what advice do you have for them now?
I think that's kind of a hard question in some ways because for us, you know, the diagnosis wasn't great for Sully. If she just had transposition of the great arteries, it actually does have a pretty high survival rate. The problem with heart conditions is heart conditions and prematurity don't really mesh very well together because the heart really needs to be fully developed. And before Sully was born, they had a lot of really hard conversations with us that I know that they needed to have. Um, but as a parent, it's not things that you want to digest or hear or have somebody say something like they don't know if they'll be able to offer your baby any options when they're born. Like that's a really scary statement to hear. Um, but I think my advice for other parents would be don't give up hope. And I remember saying to the doctors, like, I understand your concern. Um, I really did understand their concern because obviously having a preemie, I know that's some of the things that happen can be very serious. But I said she's not even born yet. I just said, why don't we let Sully tell us what she needs? And that's a hard thing to say too, because you don't want to feel like that. But I just felt like she wasn't born yet. We weren't going to decide for her yet until she told us. So
Mhm.
when she was born, she said, I'm going to kind of hang in there. And we just followed her lead. And I think that that's kind of the most important thing is you just need to follow their lead. If they're continuing to fight, then as a parent, you advocate for them. And that's what we did. So,
I love that. I love that. And I I think that's such important advice. I remember a neonatologist telling us that so often the preemies, the babies, they declare themselves. They tell you
yeah,
what they want to do. And I think
yeah,
that's a really important piece of advice. And that hope, right? Never give up hope.
yeah,
You
definitely. And
certainly did not give up hope.
yeah, we did not. And I remember there was some very hard times like that, when you're kind of realizing like you're on a difficult road that sometimes you're just like, "Oh my god, how are we going to get till tomorrow?" But you just do. So,
Mhm.
you put one foot in front of the other and you just hope the next day is a little bit better. So,
Now you knew that you were going in, you were gonna have a long NICU stay,
yeah.
CICU. You were in both the NICU and the CICU?
We were in both. So when she first got admitted, they admitted her to CICU, but the CICU is an interesting place in the sense of they're really good at caring for cardiac babies. They're definitely not as used to handling premature babies. So when she was there in her little isolette, everyone's like, "Oh my god, this is the smallest baby we've ever had." All the nurses are like, because they're used to like touching their babies a lot and doing things where like a preemie, you kind of just have to like leave them alone. Um, so then they did transfer her back to the NICU. She was there then for about a week or so before they kind of said this baby's a little too sick to be under our care, that they wanted to move her back to the CICU because I think they knew the CICU was going to be making the big decisions. So she was kind of just thrown between the two for a little while.
Okay.
And then she
How
just
did
stayed there for till her open heart until her open heart surgery.
in the CICU?
Yeah.
Yes. That's a lot for you to navigate through between 2 different units. How did you do that? And how did you build relationships with the nurses and doctors in both of those units?
Yeah, and some like we were lucky because she went back to the same NICU that she had left. So that definitely made it a little bit better, and it was kind of nice to see the same nurses that saw her like at her sickest point when they were like, "Let's get this baby out of here," because at that point she was intubated, she was on like 80% oxygen. They were like, "We need to put her somewhere where they can handle her needs for her heart. So it was kind of nice to see the same nurses who saw her when she was just so sick to come back when she was in a better place. So they were like, "Oh my God, Sully's back," and like, it just made you feel good that like somebody else like understood like what you went through, like where you'd been, like at your worst, and like now that you were kind of, not that we were totally on the other side at that point, but just to like see you in a better place. So that was nice to have that transition back to the NICU. And then the CICU, I feel like they had pods in there, which was a little bit different. I don't know when you were in the NICU what it was like there, but in NICU Northeast, it's singular rooms. So you don't really interact as much with other parents and other families. But in the CICU, for the most part, it's open pods. So you can kind of, you see more than one nurse. You get to kind of know some of the same nurses. And I felt like we spent a significant amount of time in both units, that we were able to kind of get some understanding of like, okay, this nurse knows my baby. That always makes you feel better, that type of thing.
Yes, when we were in the NICU, there were pods as well. So we did have a lot of familiar nurses who were taking care of Claire and early on Mary at the beginning. But I wanted to ask you, do you have any recommendations just for the length of time that you spent in both of these units for others who are trying to navigate through how they build a strong relationship with their medical team? What worked for you?
I think for me, like in the morning, I would kind of talk to the nurse if I had some concerns to just kind of let them know what my concerns were. Because as a parent, like sometimes, when the doctors come, they're saying a lot of medical things that maybe you don't necessarily understand. Like I said before, we did have a premature baby before, so I felt like I was well versed in some ways in a lot of the things they said. But this was also a new journey for us, and there was a lot of things that I totally didn't understand. Like, for example, Sully's heart. I had no idea why it didn't work the right way. I just knew they said something was switched that wasn't where it was supposed to be. And so I think just kind of advocating to the nurses in the morning, like say, maybe you felt like your baby wasn't really looking like themselves that day, or, they hadn't done that before, but this was a new nurse, kind of just letting them know where you stood or like what you felt. And in regard to the team at shop, it's really nice. Like they have a whole team that comes around every morning and talks to you. And then at the end, they usually like ask you what your concerns are. So I just think kind of being on a good communication level with both the doctors and nurses and making sure that everybody's really on the same page and doing what's in the best interest of your baby.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we oftentimes say that the NICU is a true roller coaster. That is so true for you, my friend. Tell
Yeah.
us what that looked like for you.
I just think, again, with Quinn, I felt the same thing. It's not always a linear path. Like there's some days that are good and some days that are bad. And when it's a bad day, it can be a really bad day. Like right before we went to the CICU, I remember they called us at 4 a.m. They told us that we had to come back to the hospital, that the baby wasn't doing well. They put her on an oscillator, which is like a different type of vent. Um, so I knew that at that point that they were obviously very concerned, and I just remember crying that entire day and just being like, knowing that we were like one step from this was getting really scary. And just realizing like the day before she wasn't even intubated, and you're just like, how did we go from a baby that was on CPAP to a baby that's now like on 80% oxygen and an oscillator? And luckily, when we moved back to the CICU, they kind of understood her heart a little bit better, and they were able to make adjustments there and for things to get better. But um, and that day was just so hard, and you're just like, you go from a good day to a bad day to, the next day things got a little better, but it just was never a linear path. And even with her heart surgery, when they told us that they had to do that, and you're just like, I just hope that they're making the best decision for Sully. Like, um, there's just a lot of things that are really hard, and you have to realize it's not always going to be linear, and there's going to be bad days, there's going to be good days. And unfortunately, sometimes it's two steps back before you start making forward motion. So that's kind of where we were at. And at the
Mhm.
end, even I remember a week or so before we came home, she had to get a scope and she had to get a G tube. So even when we were like at the end of our journey and you felt like you were so close to to being done, it was like you had to take a couple steps back before you could go home.
Do you feel like I feel like that is probably one of the hardest times too, because you think you're so close, and
Mhm,
that's where just taking it one day at a time is incredibly important, because you think you are there, and
mhm,
then G-tube, right? Which
yeah,
sets you back for the healing of that. Or we remember from laser eye surgery that Claire had in the NICU, we thought it was going to be a real quick turnaround of recovery, set us back at least a week of
yeah,
her recovery and getting closer to coming home. She had a really hard time with it. And that, I think, hits you to some extent a little harder when you're near the end.
yeah, 100%. I mean, at that point, we had spent 5 months for I guess 5 months at that point in Philadelphia, and, I had 2 other kids at home. I hadn't been with them. Now I'm thinking like, "Wow, I haven't been with my kids for almost half a year." I'd seen them sporadically when they came down every week, 2 weeks, whatever it may be. In regard to going home, like, I didn't really feel like I could leave Sully. I mean, we're talking about how serious her medical conditions were, like, how do you leave a baby like that and drive 2 hours back home? So I really only did that a handful of times. So I just feel like at the end, I kept saying to myself, like, "Oh, maybe we'll be home by 4th of July." 4th of July came and went, and then I was like, "We'll probably go home in August." August came and went, and then I was like, "Well, I hope we're home before the kids go to school." Um, then the kids went back to school, so I feel like that was kind of the turning point for me when I saw them end their school year, and now we were going back into new school year, and we still weren't home yet, and I was just missing so much of their life, and I think it was just starting to hit me so hard at the end when I was just like, "But we're so close, can we just go home?" But you knew that Sully just was not there yet. There's also that transition from going from the NICU to, they call it complex care, and that was a hard transition for me to leave the security of the NICU, to go to somewhere where it's more of like, I guess, less nursing staff and things like that, which is scary for a parent who had a baby in the ICU all these months to kind of scale things back. So I just feel like there was a lot of changes at the end that were hard for me.
And how long have you been out of the NICU now?
So we came home towards the end of September. So October, November, like almost 4 months.
Okay.
Probably 4
And
months or so.
And I think it's so important to acknowledge as well. You've just been out of the hospital for 4 months with Solly at home, back at home with the older kids too. But I can hear you and see you getting emotional talking about the story, and it's always okay, right? And no matter, I mean, 13 years later, I still cry and
Yeah,
cry sometimes and think about it and go through it, and it never leaves you, and it's
never leaves
okay.
you. Yeah.
And it probably never left you from
It
Quinn's
didn't.
experience too,
No,
right?
and
I mean,
it absolutely did not, and I don't wanna take away from anyone's experience because I actually had 3 kids that did NICU stays. Even Reed, my oldest, spent 48 hours in NICU, and I just remember being a first-time mom, that was so scary.
mhm.
Um, and then I had Quinn, and I was like, "Oh, that wasn't so scary," and then when I had Sully, I was like, "Oh, I guess when I had Quinn, that wasn't so scary," but it's all relative. Like, if your baby spends an hour, if they spend 2 hours, if they spend 2 days, like, it's just scary for somebody to tell you that your baby is not healthy. And I think it's traumatic on some level, no matter what, if your baby goes to the NICU. So, um, I remember with Quinn, like sometimes, especially her birthday, I don't know why her birthdays always hit me hard. Like her first birthday, I just remember that just being so emotional for me. Um, and like even today starts the heart month for Sully, and I was going through pictures this morning from her heart surgery, and I was just like crying looking at these pictures because I was just like, oh my God, like look how far we've come in such a short amount of time. So I think some days it just hits you harder than others, but not like in a way that it's like sad, in a way that's like, wow, like we've really been through it, and now we're on the other side, but that was really hard.
Really hard. I mean, incredible. It has to be so hard looking at those photos. Uh, so you certainly had the roller coaster experience, from the phone calls at 4 AM to seeing the good days with Sally to being able to bring her home. Talk to us about your experience bonding with her from the beginning. How did that look?
Yeah. I think it's so hard in some ways to bond in the beginning, but you just have to find different ways. And I found this with a lot of things in the NICU, whether it's celebrating something you might not have celebrated, like who wants to celebrate 100 days in the NICU? But here we are, like putting up 100 days sign and taking pictures of her as an old lady, and, you know, just doing anything that you can to kind of reach a milestone. And you're just like, let's just celebrate this because we can, let's look for something. Let's look for the silver lining in this, whether it's like, okay, I'm just going to hold my baby's hand. I'm going to sit next to the isolette and read to them. In the beginning, we really just couldn't hold her a lot because she was intubated, and it takes like 2 or 3 people to help you hold your baby when they're intubated. And on top of it, it's a little bit scary, to be honest with you, because you're like so afraid you're going to move the wrong way or do the wrong thing. So there is a little bit of fear involved in even bonding with your baby in that way. But I feel like just being there, whether they know you're there or not, for yourself, kind of just to be there, to take pictures, to like celebrate the little tiny things that you can celebrate. So because you're robbed of so much, and you just have to take what you have and kind of go with it. And that's kind of what we did in regard to bonding. Any chance they gave me, of course I held her. If I couldn't hold her, I sat next to her isolette. Sometimes I would just talk to her or read her a book. Just really anything that you can do to be closer to your baby. And the nurses are really good with that too. Like, we got a book from you actually before I even knew who you were. So we got, I can't remember what was going on. It must have been in April. We got, oh my gosh, now I can't think. Is it
On
Good
the
Night
night you were born.
The night you were born.
Mm-hmm.
And we got that in the NICU before you had even come to the Ronald McDonald House to talk to us. So there was a connection there even before I met you. Because we were in Philadelphia, I wasn't bringing down children's books, so it was just nice to have little things to find ways to bond with your baby, because it's not that same. I remember always saying, like, I always wanted that moment, like where you gave birth and they put the baby on your chest. And and I didn't get that, but I have other things. That's okay. It's okay to have a different path and do it a different way.
And
Like,
you
at
have
the end of the
rocked that
day,
path. You
yeah,
have rocked that path. I think you brought up such a good point around celebrating the milestones that you don't necessarily want to celebrate,
yeah.
and finding the joy in those difficult moments. And I think for you too, her wardrobe during your NICU stay was top notch. And if anyone listening is on Instagram, where can they follow your journey and look back at all of Sully's matching onesies and sheet collection that she had?
So they can follow us at From Minnie to Moose, and she definitely owned a lot of clothes, because that was something that we could do to celebrate. People, I think we own every print ever made at Little Sleepies, because it's like that bamboo fabric, and they made them in preemie sizes. So that was just kind of like our way of bonding every day. I'd be like, let's dress her up and take a picture and, you know, do something in regard to that. So she had quite the wardrobe down in her little closet down in Philadelphia. So
I love that. And even the books, right? We talk a lot about just bringing books,
yep,
reading books, all those different simple things of ways that you can bond with your baby. We sang Declare all the time, every single day. It's probably why she loves to sing today.
yeah.
But, all of those things just to help bond for sure. So you spent 5 months in the NICU and the CICU combined. You come home. Something we talk to families about all the time is it's exciting to come home,
Mhm.
it's scary to come home,
Yeah.
and also working through family dynamics of visitors. Everybody's so excited to meet the baby, but when you're bringing home a fragile child, a medically fragile child, what did that look like for you all?
So I come from a very large family. I'm one of 5, and then my dad's one of 12. So I have a lot of family. But I do feel like everybody kind of understood, maybe because I've been down this path before, that you needed to distance yourself. So, like, even if my sisters came over, my brother came over to see the baby, like, they weren't like, oh, let me hold the baby or let me kiss the baby. They were like, let me look at the baby from afar, you know? So I just think, in general, I had boundaries and people respected those boundaries. And I think that people just need to be understanding if you come home with a baby, that it's not, when you come home with a NICU baby, it's not just coming home with a regular newborn, which again, you still need to be careful, but a germ can just be so dangerous for them. It can land them back in the hospital. And especially after you just spent 5 months there, the last thing that you want to do is go back. So even with my kids coming in from school, it was a little harder this time around because they're 9 and 7. And as you know, kids come home with everything. So when they came home, it's like, change your clothes, go wash your hands. We really didn't have anybody handle the baby for quite a long time, aside from my husband and I. Like we would let the kids hold her here or there. We've kind of gotten to the point now where my mom or my mother-in-law will watch her, but even still, like my sisters still don't ask to hold the baby, and they kind of just understand like that we just need to keep her safe. And that's okay with everybody. And I think as long as people understand that you're just doing your job as a mom to keep your baby safe, that they should respect those boundaries.
And really setting the boundaries that work for you,
Yeah.
right? I mean, saying this is what works for our family. And setting up those guidelines ahead of time.
Yeah, and everybody's different in regard to that. Like maybe some people are a little stricter and some people aren't. And there's not really a right answer necessarily, because people have different circumstances in life too. Like I know there was moms in NICU who didn't have any maternity leave left. So when they came home, somebody needed to watch their baby, or maybe their baby needs to go to some type of daycare. So there's just different circumstances sometimes surrounding that. But it just
Mhm.
has to be what you're comfortable with, and you kind of need to hold a firm line and let other people know what those boundaries are.
All right. We talked a little bit earlier about your biggest piece of advice when you face kind of a difficult diagnosis. But when you look back on your whole journey, what's an important lesson you learned that you want to share with other families?
I think just despite what people tell you, I kind of said this earlier, but you need to follow your baby's lead and follow what they want you to do. So I just think it's, don't give up hope before they're telling you to do so. So I think sometimes it's not the greatest diagnosis. Sometimes you might not hear things that you want to hear. Sometimes it might be something scary. But I think it's just to follow your baby's lead and do what you know as a parent is best for them.
Great. And tell us how Sully's doing today.
Sully is doing great. She's actually getting PT right now. So she gets some early intervention. But aside from that, she's really happy and healthy. And, we have a lot of doctor follow up appointments and things like that. But overall, being home, I feel like she's just thrived.
Well, she is adorable. Her smile lights up my face every time I see it. I love it. And make sure you follow From Minnie to Moose to get a chance to check out Sully's journey. But Colleen, I can't thank you enough for being on the NICU Today podcast. Really means a lot. I'm so glad that our paths crossed and you're part of the Today is a Good Day community as well. But thanks for being here, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the NICU Today podcast, brought to you by Today is a Good Day. Learn more at todayisagoodday.org.